So today I'm going to talk to you guys about mold illness, and it happened to me not once, but twice. So I used to hear the words mold and think just the fuzzy stuff that you see maybe on a shower, or purple stuff growing, just like mildew even in the home, and think no big deal, just clean it up. Why do people talk about this being a hazard to your health? Until of course it happened to me. And I was actually living in a rental home for 2 years before I even discovered this mold being an issue. But progressively over the course of that 2 years, my health began to plummet. So from autoimmune diseases just starting to creep up, things like Hashimoto's, I was actually diagnosed with lupus as well, some colitis on a colonoscopy. So it's just like really weird. And then brain fog, migraine headaches I'd never had before, allergies to things like cats that my roommate had, and just increased food sensitivities. And then shortness of breath, that was probably one of my biggest symptoms. So I was diagnosed with asthma, and I had never had asthma in my life before. And so over the span of 2 years, my health went from right here to right there. And as a nutritionist, functional medicine practitioner, therapist, like health is what I eat, live, and breathe. And so it was just really crazy for me, doing all the things to be healthy, and yet nothing was working. Everything really came to a head the night that I woke up at 2 a.m. feeling like I was having a heart attack, and chest pains, and difficulty breathing, and of course turned to Google, like what is happening? And it tells me I'm having a heart attack. So I decided to go down the street to an ER right in my neighborhood actually. And when I got there, they said, no, I'm not having a heart attack. I was having a severe asthma attack, and I'd never had that again in my life. And I just remember something in my mind flickering, mold. Like what maybe putting two and two together of, is that musty smell that I've been smelling every day that I walk up my stairs? Like, is there something there? We had recently just turned on the air conditioning in the unit or in the home for the spring. And I think that night it just all got kicked up, and it was the catalyst that really sent my body into this tailspin. And I'll never forget the words that the doctor said to me in the ER. And when I asked him, I think, could it be something related to my environment that I'm living in? And he looked at me and said, Lauren, there's some things that conventional medicine will never be able to help you with. This is one of them. And I just remember thinking, like, hitting my stomach, something has got to change. Contrary to popular belief, mold is not an allergy. Some people are allergic to mold, but what I'm talking about today is actually toxic mold. And so if you're living in a toxic mold environment and you happen to have the perfect storm of the right genetic predisposition or the right underlying just symptoms and diagnoses. So for example, autoimmunity is very common with those that are going to get sick with mold illness. That toxic mold is toxic mold. It's like a biotoxin actually used in biological warfare. We call the spores off of mold mycotoxins. And so they are not innate to the environment. They are the toxins that the mold spores actually put off. And these mycotoxins cannot even be seen with the naked eye. And so contrary again to popular belief as well, that mold is something fuzzy that you see just growing on the shower. That is mold, yes, mycotoxins are different, and mycotoxins can be left for many, many years after a mold or water damage kind of event, or leak, just a minor leak even that you get in your home. In my own personal story, in case, the mold in our home was in the HVAC, the heating and ventilation and air conditioning system, spores accumulating over the course of however many years. It was a 10-year-old home, not super old, not super new. We had also had a flooding event in the Austin area about 6 months prior that had left some water damage on one of our sidewalls. So we get a lot of the residual rain from, say, like hurricanes that happen in Houston, and that would happen to be Hurricane Harvey. And so couple those two things together, and the home just began to go down as well, along with my own health. Some other really interesting symptoms that I began to develop One was called multiple chemical sensitivity. So I became increasingly just sensitive to all sorts of environments, not just moldy environments, but environments that I would go into, say like even a new house build or a new building where I'd be smelling paints or off-gassing from new materials, to sensitivities to like clothing or other people's clothing. So if you ever walked into a thrift store, you probably know what that musty smell smells like, or a library even. And I became increasingly sensitive to environments such as that. To this day, I can actually walk into several, just even retail stores, brand new, Anthropologie, Madewell, etc. There's certain stores here in Austin that there's actually mold in the building and I can smell it, and I cannot even buy clothes from that actual store because the clothes have become contaminated. And that's a whole nother rabbit hole to go down, would be the contamination that can happen from mold exposure, mycotoxin exposure. So not only to your body and your health are you affected, but actually stuff is affected as well. Mycotoxins love porous items, so things like clothing, things like wood, furniture, upholstery, books, papers, you name it. The mycotoxins really don't discriminate, basically. And I just became increasingly sensitive to actually the stuff I had as well. So as I began to learn about mold being an issue in my home, realizing I needed to get out of the home, it also came along with a realization that I couldn't be around a lot of my stuff that actually had been in that home. I actually went through 2 cars as well. So when I was living in that toxic mold environment for 2 years and just bringing things in and out of the home, from my backpack that I would bring with my laptop in it to just, items that you bring about in your daily life, and not to mention myself and my body. A lot of those mycotoxins, we call that cross-contamination. Cross-contaminated my other environments, such as my car that I was in. So it would get recirculated in my air conditioning in the car. So my car was making me sick as well. Moving out of mold was not easy, but it was one of the best things that I could have done for my health. And you'll read some stories maybe online about people living in mold and saying that they had to leave it all behind. And I remember scouring Dr. Google many hours, basically trying to find people's stories. Did they get rid of stuff? Do you really have to get rid of stuff? Where did they go and what did they do to recover? And that was one of the universal themes that I found was getting out of the environment is a huge piece to the recovery of mold and being able to actually detox it out of your body. And then number 2 is separating yourself, even if you don't if you're not ready to fully separate, getting a storage unit and putting your stuff in that storage unit, but separating yourself from your things. That way, when you are in that most reactive state, you can really get a breather and come up for air. I've mentioned some of my mold illness symptoms, but symptoms are really varied depending on the individual and your underlying predisposition. So some people feel just a ton of brain fog. Maybe they have weight gain, and it's like seemingly no matter what they do, diet, exercise, thyroid medications don't seem to work. Thyroid problems and Hashimoto's is a really common overlap, as is SIBO. So if you have reoccurrent small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or bloating, IBS-like symptoms that don't go away despite, again, a clean diet or maybe doing the antibiotics or herbal therapies for SIBO or repeat therapies, that could be a sign. Just basically, if you're doing all the things and nothing is working or nothing has seemed to help, that can oftentimes point you and your clinician to digging a bit deeper and seeing if there's anything environmental going on in your space. And mold being a huge factor, over 1 in 2 buildings, or at least 1 in 2 buildings, have been estimated to have water damage and mold and or mycotoxins floating in the air. And so it is a human health problem and epidemic, I would say, that mainstream conventional medicine and even a lot of holistic practitioners just are not looking at. Again, as a holistic practitioner myself, it was many years being in the field prior to mold for myself happening to me, and it's now one of the first things that I will look for early on in an individual that is complaining or experiencing a variety of issues health-wise. So how do you know mold is a problem or if you have mold? And so it's twofold. There's mold in your body and then there's mold in your environment. Ways to test for mold, it's actually simpler than you may think. You don't even have to call an inspector to come to your house. There's an ERMI test is what it's called. It's a cloth sample that really will be a good baseline for assessing the mycotoxins in the home. And so this ERMI dust sample, mycotoxins are very heavy, so they like to fall to the ground. Again, you can't see them with the naked eye, but they do collect in dust and on things. And so with this ERMI test, you would just swipe around the home, whether it's on the baseboards, on some of the furniture, upholstery. You could do it in multiple rooms in the house. You could isolate rooms if you think you have more of a mold problem in a certain room, as well as by the air vents. You don't have to do it right on your air vent, but with that ERMI test, that can be a really good triage for the mycotoxicity of the home. Every home will have some mold. Mold is a part of life. It's just what is the threshold and what is the toxicity and the off-putting of that mold from a toxin level. For your body, I would say there's mycotoxin urine testing is a really good triage for human health and just kind of what we know to date as one of the baselines in the functional medicine world. So a mycotoxin urine test, and there's two primary labs I'll use. One is called Great Plains Labs. The other is Real Time Labs. There are a couple of blood tests as well that can be good, just spot checks. And so TGF beta-1 growth factor is one of them that a lot of individuals with mold illness will have a spike in elevation in. C-reactive protein and inflammatory marker is another one, homocysteine, and one more. There's a host of them though. You can look up Shoemaker Labs, and Richie Shoemaker is a doctor that kind of put mold first on the radar. And so he has several lab markers and baselines that you can check. And most are not going to be included on a CBC, like a general blood panel. They are specialty labs that working with a mold literate practitioner would probably be the best for you to figure out the body workup that you may need for the diagnosis of mold illness and toxicity. So how to detox from mold. So once I figured out I had mold, and I've talked about getting out of mold was one of the first things I needed to do. Now going to a mold-free home, say that in quotes, mold-free home, it was very difficult for me here in Austin. Austin is notoriously a humid state for one, a humid state. Austin is notoriously a humid city. We get a lot of, when it rains, it pours, and flooding, very common. And so there is a lot of water damaged buildings here. And so getting to higher ground is something people in the moldy world will talk about, is getting, going on a sabbatical perhaps to somewhere like the mountains, or just an outdoor, like just more nature. I always felt so much better outside. Over the course of a year, I actually moved 11 times because I was just so reactive to the environments between the mold and the multiple chemical sensitivities. And then another condition called mast cell activation syndrome, which was really my body just going haywire from an immune perspective. And very sensitive to environments, foods, and all sorts of just like little nuances that would throw my homeostasis out of balance. So one bad night of sleep, for example, or a little bit too intense on a workout, those things would really set my immune system off. And so in that reactive state, it was really about getting to higher ground for me. And there were many nights that I actually would sleep on like the balconies of apartments that I had rented. Like I always felt better outside. One night I remember sleeping in the media room in a huge condo complex because I could not tolerate the building itself. And actually that one building that I was in ended up flooding 7 days after me being into it. Within 48 hours, I was already sick. My body knew something was up. And come lo and behold, there is actually a pipe that burst on my whole floor, which is the 23rd floor of a huge condo. And the whole building ended up flooding. And so it was like my body was a metal detector for that. So the getting out of the mold was a very difficult and challenging part of the recovery. But I always just continue to remind myself that when given the right tools, the body innately wants to heal itself, and to really believe that And so to not lose hope in that struggle, that I hadn't always been that way, and I knew I could get back to a baseline of not being so reactive as well. As far as what detox looks like from mold, it's very varied for individuals, and there's multiple detox therapies out there, but several things that really helped me I'll share with you. And so number one was actually infrared sauna. So sweating daily was huge. I'm not a good detoxifier, just my body is not. So I'm an undermethylator, which means my liver does not detox toxins very well and break them down. And so I sometimes have to do external forces such as a sauna or dry brushing that can be really helpful for cleansing and facilitating that. Number two would be loving my gut. And so that's a very Wild West term as well, but really leaning into how can I build up my good gut bug army with probiotics that I could tolerate, as well as fiber and prebiotic kind of foods that I could tolerate. And so it was building up that tolerance. So 70% of your immune system is actually inside your gut. And so I continue to hold to that fact that if I could have a healthier biome, then those good gut bugs could help me stave off a lot of the toxins that were circulating in my body and continually compounding me in the environment as well. And so loving my gut looked like taking quality probiotics that my body could tolerate. I was very histamine intolerant, so that not all probiotics are good for that condition. Working with a practitioner that gets that is really essential to know those nuances. Prebiotics, which would be fiber-rich foods, again, that I could tolerate, and building up that tolerance because I had developed all sorts of gut unrest too. So like FODMAP, high FODMAP foods, which are found in things like broccoli, Brussels sprouts, apples. There's a whole list of them. I couldn't tolerate initially. I've built up that tolerance over time, but to help my body with those prebiotics attached to the probiotics to again build up the gut. And short chain fatty acids were another thing. As far as other supports, I did IV therapies. And so IV therapies are exactly what they sound like, but they're receiving nutrients, not just like liquids or fluids that you may be familiar with IVs. And so I would get phosphatidylcholine and then vitamin C and glutathione infusions. And that would be anywhere from 2 to 3 times a week in the initial stages, and then progressing down to 1 time a week. And today I really don't need IV therapies, but doing those for several months really helped, kind of like my body being on an escalator up on the detox versus dragging my suitcase up a flight of stairs on the detox journey. And it was just really helpful in lifting some of the load off my own body's struggles with detox. Fresh air, walks, and sunshine, I've already mentioned, just feeling really so much better when I was outside versus a lot of indoor environments. So anytime that I would feel like just super compounded or that I was in a flare, getting outside was a huge piece of my healing. Smart supplementation. So there is a host of supplements out there, and one of the things that I hate doing as a practitioner is being like a supplement pharmacy for my patients. And I really hated that as well as a patient. And so helping individuals, including myself, find what were the key supplements for my body, and same thing for my patients. And there's really no one size fits all approach here. It really depends on underlying symptoms, for one, as well as like what your body can or cannot tolerate. So for example, binders are very popular within the mold healing space. Like binders are what help zap up or soak up the toxins in the body. And so things like charcoal, bentonite clay, psyllium, there's a whole variety of them, chlorella. And I, being one that's prone to constipation, didn't always do well with the binders. And so I had to find some gentler ones for my body to be able to soak up those toxins, as well as we called it drainage support, which I used a lot of homeopathics, that drops that would help mobilize toxins in my body again, so those binders could zap them up. Definitely want to make sure you're pooping every day. And so that's oftentimes one of the first things I will do with a patient initially, is just making sure we've got their bowels moving daily. Your bowels are what are help cleansing out toxins of your body naturally, as well as just like waste. And so if you're not going to the bathroom, if you are constipated and stopped up, you're not ready to detox, because you're just gonna compound the detox effect inside your body. And we don't want that. Working with my own team. So as a practitioner, I do realize the value, like every practitioner should have a practitioner, like every therapist should have a therapist, every coach have a coach. I really didn't want to go it alone. And I really hate to see that for folks when they feel like they've got it, just got to do this Dr. Google thing, I'm going to heal on my own. And I think working with a team can be really transformational in the healing journey. So you don't feel like you're shooting darts in the dark. And so connecting again with a mold literate practitioner, and I had several great voices within my healing journey, and I really garnered great information and insights from them all. And so your team may have multiple team members throughout your healing journey as well, and that's okay. They're really there to help support you and guide you in the detox and the healing process. And then a secret sauce would just be like what I call like gut love and just connection, like connection with those that are closest to you. Mold doesn't just affect you, it affects the individuals around you. And sometimes it can feel like for the worst, like especially when it doesn't feel like everyone else gets it. It's crazy that mold can seemingly affect one individual in a home, but not the other. But it's not that crazy, because we all are biochemically, physiologically really different. And so your genetic predisposition to getting sick from mold, mycotoxin illness, is one thing. Your health history is another. Like we all come from different backgrounds on really what our health has looked like throughout our lives. I would say the cards were stacked against my own health from birth. I've always had gut issues, for example. So that means I've always had immune issues, for example. And then I struggled for many, many years with disordered eating and anorexia. And so that didn't do my body any favors as well. So it really, you can't compare apples to oranges because we're all so different. But I think definitely the relationships in our lives can also be a great adjunct and lift in the healing process. Something that I noticed was a really, just interesting observation in my healing journey. I went home to visit my parents and my family probably about 6 months into my healing. I was not still feeling 100% at all. And my parents actually do live in a moldy home. I've had them tested before. They have 2 homes. They have a lake house and then they have their home. And both of them are actually, they have some mycotoxin in them. Suffice to say, I wanted to go see them. I spent a lot of times outdoors, but something that I really was kind of proud of my body in is that I was able to tolerate the environment so much better than I thought. And I think a big reason why was because I was actually just around people and connected. I'd been living on my own in an Airbnb by myself for the past 3 or 4 months prior to seeing them. And there's just something about people and humans and feeling supported in our journeys that I think can be a huge lift off in our own healing journey as well. So staying connected to those that are closest to you, I think can be really great. And then one more thing I'll say is just there's a huge talk in the mold space about healing the limbic system. That's part of your brain that holds on to memories. And so PTSD of going through mold for one. So it was something that I really had to work through in order to begin to tolerate environments, again, that were not that moldy home I had been living in. I had so much kind of trauma from that, even heart attack experience that I had had. And then the trauma of getting out of that environment and just how hard that was. And so I would go into new environments and maybe they come back clean on a mycotoxin test, but I could still be reactive because I was scared of that happening again. And so for healing that limbic system, I really had to do some therapeutic work on the brain. And there's several techniques out there. A couple things I would encourage you to check out. One is called DNRS, Dynamic Neural Retraining Systems. The other is called the Gupta program. And then even NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, those 3 things are they're out there and accessible for individuals to take advantage of. Those are just some examples of some tools that helped me with healing my limbic system. I'm gonna definitely create more content around mold, toxic mold. Would love to hear what you guys are wanting to know, what kind of content you want to see. If there's one thing that I leave you with, it's this. When given the right tools, your body innately wants to heal itself. I believe it, and I hope you do too.